Okay, great. Well, welcome to this webinar on the pulp and paper methodology, and we'll talk a bit about the public consultation and road test as well. Thank you all for joining us. So yeah, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing that recording as well as of the information that we'll talk about in the webinar as well in a follow-up email. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. So hi, my name is Alice De Palma. I work at CDP and I'm part of the ACT team. And I've been leading on the development of the pulp and paper methodology from the CDP side. And I'm here with my colleague Anaïs from ADEM. So Anaïs, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alice. So hi, everyone. I'm Anaïs Gobarden, working at ADEM. And as Alice just said, I was co-leading the methodology development for pulp and paper with Alice. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So in terms of the agenda for this webinar, first we'll introduce the ACT initiative briefly. Then we'll go over some of the key elements of the pulp and paper methodology that we took into account when developing the methodology. We'll move on then to the public consultation and explain how you can take part, what the benefits are. And then finally moving on to the road test and explain a bit like what the road test phase is and why your company should take part in it before moving on to the next steps. Right, so I'll start right away with what is the ACT initiative. So ACT stands for Assessing the Low Carbon Transition. It's an initiative, well, it's a global initiative that was co-founded by both CDP and ADEM. So ADEM is the French agency for the ecological transition, and it was founded back in 2015. For this specific project, which focuses on the development of sectoral methodologies, this was co-funded by Climate Kick, which is a body of the European Union. And so what is ACT and what does it aim to do? So ACT aims to provide an accountability framework by assessing how a company's climate strategy and how companies' actions contribute to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, so staying well below 2-degree warming. And how do we do that? We do that by developing methodologies that allow us to conduct ACT assessments. So an assessment is an analysis of a company's climate strategy against different qualitative and quantitative indicators. These indicators are sector specific, and what it gives us at the end is an ACT rating, which is an overview of the company's readiness to decarbonize. And what you get also is a feedback report from the company with tailored recommendations that kind of identifies both the gaps as well as the strengths of the company's strategy. Right, so in terms of, well, we know there's been a few global initiatives and it can be hard to kind of understand how they all fit together. So we use the image of the mitigation goal of the Paris Agreement being a marathon to kind of try to explain how some of these initiatives fit together. So if we keep this image, if we look at, first of all, the TCFD recommendations, they can be compared to if an individual is considering the advantages as well as the risks and level of commitments that are required for them to run the marathon. Then they move on to the second step where we can compare reporting to CDP with kind of the person sharing their running track record and performance. And then they move on to step 3, which is about setting a goal to complete the marathon in a suitable time, which is where we land with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, helping companies to set targets according to science. And then fourth step is where ACT comes into place, which is helping you determine whether the training program that you've developed is rigorous enough and will help you achieve the goal of the marathon. So to summarize, how ACT fits in with these initiatives is it provides this accountability mechanism to help companies kind of assess whether their commitments are ambitious enough and whether the actions that they have in place are rigorous enough to help them achieve these commitments. So we've been working and developing methodologies, sectoral methodologies to cover the highest emitting sectors. And that's following kind of the TCFD recommendations that have identified these highest emitting sectors. So we have some methodologies that were completed. So the ones that you can see on the left-hand side, so methodologies to assess auto manufacturers, electric utilities, retail, building, oil and gas, transport, cement, and real estate companies. All of those are were completed and are available on the ACT website. There's 3 methodologies that are currently at the road test phase, which is the kind of pilot phase with voluntary companies. And these ones are for iron and steel, agri-food and agriculture, as well as a generic methodology. And right now, we have 4 methodologies that are still under development to be finalized very soon. And that includes glass, chemicals, the one that we're talking about today, which is pulp and paper, as well as aluminium. And so all of these methodologies are sector specific, and we make sure to include the context and levers of each sector in each of these methodologies. And I mentioned very briefly what you get at the end of that ACT assessment, which is an ACT rating. So we'll just go in a bit more detail in terms of what is included in that ACT rating. So you've got 3 dimensions or 3 different scores: the performance score, the narrative score, and the trend score. The performance score, so the one in red, is made up of 9 different modules that look at all of the different elements that you can see on the slide, going from targets all the way to assessing the business model of companies. And what it does really is it measures the alignment of a company with specific low carbon KPIs. And that score ranges from 1 all the way to 20. Then we move on to the narrative score, the one in purple, which looks at different aspects such as the business model and the strategy of the company, as well as the consistency and credibility of their strategy, the reputation of the company, and whether they've assessed the risks that have to do with transitioning to a low carbon economy. And the purpose of the narrative score is to give you a holistic summary of the assessment based on all of the data that was collected by the analyst during the ACT assessment. And the score that you get out of C to A being the best score. And finally, the trend score, which looks at or tries to give a forecast of future changes. So it looks at if the ACT assessment was done again in the near future, how is the company's score likely to change? Is it likely to decrease, stay the same, or improve? So what this gives you at the end is this rating made up of 3 dimensions, which looks at really all of the aspects of decarbonization and really allows for a very high level of detail for the feedback that you get out of it, that feedback report at the end. Right, so that was the presentation of the ACT initiative. If you do, I forgot to mention at the beginning, but if you do have any questions, feel free to put them either in the Q&A box or in the chat. All of the participants are muted, so we'll just go through the questions, yeah, either through Q&A or the chat, and we'll stop after each section to make sure that we answer all of your questions. I'll just wait a minute to see if there's anything that pops up, and if not, we'll move on to the methodology and the key elements of the methodology. Okay, I think we'll move on. Just before that, there are some colleagues that have joined us from Deloitte who helped develop the pulp and paper methodology. So, Andres, I'm going to make you a panelist so that you can unmute yourself if you want and also help answer the questions, just so you know. Okay, that should be done. Great. Okay, I'll move on to the key elements of the pulp and paper methodology. And I'll start with some of the key considerations that we took into account when developing this methodology. So we've been working on it since January or February of this year. So we have a time span of about 6 months to develop this methodology. And that also kind of makes an impact in terms of the elements that we can take into account and how we can take them into account. So the first one was to develop a relevant low carbon pathway so that we could assess companies in the sector against a benchmark that was ambitious enough. We also, so another aspect that we really needed to take into consideration was the impact of deforestation for timber. So we managed to include that, and we'll talk about it a bit later in the slides. We also needed to take into account the use of biomass, and more specifically sustainable biomass. So we also have a couple of indicators looking at that. There was a question of how to consider biogenic emissions as well as biogenic removals. So we'll see how we consider that quite quickly. And then finally, we wanted to take into account how to assess the kind of levels of fiber recycling or recovering that happens in the sector. So we'll go over that quite quickly, and obviously if you do have any questions, comments or feedback, we'll also talk about the public consultation, which is your chance to kind of provide that feedback and help us make the methodology as robust as possible. So to develop this methodology over the past few months, we've had the help of a technical working group that is made up of the different organizations and companies that you can see here on the slide. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, we also had very helpful technical support from the team at Deloitte France. Right, so one of the first questions in terms of methodology was which companies can be assessed with this ACT Pulp and Paper methodology. So we looked at the different companies that work within the value chain of the pulp and paper sector, and we also looked at where the most significant emission sources are. And what you can see here on the slide is the companies are in dark purple are the ones that can be assessed by this methodology. So we focused on the ones where there was most of the emissions and where there was also the kind of power to mitigate these emissions. So we'll look at companies that produce pulp, manufacturers of paper and board, as well as converters of these products. And we'll also look at companies that are integrated along the value chain, whether it's integrated along the entire value chain or semi-integrated. And then the other companies that you can see in light purples, we considered, but we decided to exclude, which means that they cannot be assessed using this ACT methodology, mostly because either their main activity is not within that sector, for example, transport companies, or the producers of chemicals that are being used, or the emissions that they produce are considered insignificant, and so they can be assessed using the ACT generic methodology, but not a methodology specific for the pulp and paper sector. Okay, so in terms of benchmarking companies against a low carbon pathway, we wanted to use a pathway that was as relevant for the sector as possible. So the data source that we use for that is the Energy Technology Perspectives report published in 2017 by the International Energy Agency. And that includes data from the pulp and paper sector as well as the power sector for Scope 2 emissions. And we are making sure that this low carbon pathway is applicable to the 3 categories of companies that we define that can be assessed by the methodology. So again, just as a reminder, looking at producers of pulp and paper, converters of paper and board, as well as integrated companies. And the way that we define the company pathway, so the way that we go from a pathway at the sectoral level down to the company level, is we use the sectoral decarbonization approach that was developed by the Science Based Initiative. Then looking a bit more in detail at the performance module of the ACT initiative. So we had a look just a few slides ago at the 3 different dimensions of the ACT score. And now we're looking more specifically at the performance score, so the different kind of low carbon key performance indicators that we use to assess a company. And there's 9 of these modules. So the 4 first modules, so targets, looking at the emissions reduction targets, material investments, looking at the emissions from current and planned assets and processes, intangible investment, looking at the investment of the company in research and development, as well as investment in low carbon technologies. And finally, sole product performance. So looking at the emissions of the product in the value chain, both upstream and downstream. So these 4 first modules are usually more quantitative, and that's where we'll see the low carbon pathway that I just presented come in to help with the assessment of companies. And then from modules 5, management and onwards, looking at engagement with suppliers, with clients, with policy, and looking at the development of new business models. These modules are generally more qualitative. And we will now talk a bit more in terms of some specific elements and how they fit into these different modules. Talking about the weightings first. So I've presented briefly the 9 modules that we've got in the performance score. And we have different weightings for each of these modules for the 3 different types of companies that we presented. Because we know that depending on the company, depending on where they are in the value chain, we need to take into account, well, some of the elements that we need to take into account carry a different weight, and some are not as important as others. And we try to reflect that by having different weightings. So, for example, the setting of emissions reduction target, including the kind of time horizon of the targets, that's quite important. So we've said this is at 15% weighting for all of the 3 categories of companies. But in terms of material investment, so the second module, the module that looks at emissions from current and planned assets and processes of the company, that's quite high for both integrated companies as well as pulp and paper manufacturers, where quite a lot of their emissions come from their assets and processes. And if we move on to module 4, where we look at indirect emissions from kind of the rest of the value chain, these emissions are, and this module is still considered quite important. So the module still has quite a high weighting. But if we look at paper and board converters, this is where they get the most amount of weighting. So we consider that emissions upstream are some of the most important emissions for the companies for paper and board converters, and so the weighting needs to be quite high for module 4. So I won't spend too much time talking about the weightings, but just want to give you a quick examples of how they work and why they differ depending on the type of categories. And what I'd like you to get out of it is the fact that each of the weighting of the modules is tailored to the type of company so that we make sure we take the most important elements into account. Right, and in terms of some of the key elements, so I mentioned the key considerations at the beginning, and I just wanted to quickly talk about how some of these considerations were included in the sectoral methodology, because it wasn't always possible to assess them using a quantitative benchmark. So in some cases, we had to find different ways of integrating and assessing the different elements. So the first one is the sustainability of woody biomass. So we know that the use of biomass is a major lever for the pulp and paper sector, and we really wanted to look at the aspect of is the woody biomass being used sustainable? So we don't. So what we are doing to assess this aspect is using existing standard, and that includes the European RED II directive or any other kind of existing international guidelines to help assess the company's use of sustainable woody biomass. And that assessment is done qualitatively using a maturity matrix. We also talked about the use of deforestation for timber, which is again another major lever for the sector. And the way that we are assessing the kind of company's commitment to tackling deforestation and having zero conversion is using, again, a maturity matrix, which is based on an existing standard developed. Well, the standard is the Forest 500 methodology, which we've used as a basis to kind of take the indicators that seem more relevant for ACT and kind of include that into the methodology and use it to assess companies. We also look at the biogenic emissions and removals, which was mentioned in the technical working group, and kind of just make sure that we value the amount of carbon that is stored in products. And for that, we found a biogenic carbon footprint calculator that was developed by WWF and Qantas, and we are assessing that quantitatively thanks to that calculator. Then the last two elements that we are taking into account that were really important was the use of recovered fiber in pulp and paper products. So this one was still investigating and making sure that the benchmark that we use is as accurate as possible. So we were still working on it, and it will be some type of ratio and be assessed quantitatively. And finally, the last element is looking at emissions from transport, both upstream and downstream. And for that, it will be a qualitative assessment using a maturity matrix, and we'll make sure that the company has target in place as well as actions that they are implementing in order to reduce emissions from the transport of their products, whether they own their own fleet or whether they outsource the transport to other companies. Right, so these were the key elements of the methodology. I hope it was clear, and let's wait maybe 1 minute to see if there are any questions popping up. If not, I'll pass it over to my colleague Anais to talk about the public consultation as well as the road test phase. And if you do have any questions that come through the chat, or if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can still come back to them. I think there's one that came up. Okay, so I don't think everyone is able to see it, but let me just read it out. So someone is asking if there is a methodology for printing companies. So no, there's no methodology for printing companies. So if I go back to that graph where you can see which companies can be assessed, printing companies were considered to be outside of the scope of the pulp and paper methodology, and considering the level of emissions, I assume that they would go under the ACT generic methodology in order to be assessed. Okay.
Will we proceed? Yes.
Yes, I'll pass the rights over to you, Anais, so you can move the slides.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so now let's move on to the next steps of this methodology development and the tests. So let's start with the pulp and paper consultation. So the public consultation will run through the month of June. So we are expecting to start publishing the reports online. So ideally from tomorrow, but that will be more probably during this week. So probably from the 3rd of June, we will let everybody know when it's published. So anyone from the sector, from the pulp and paper sector, is really encouraged to provide comments on the methodology that is currently being developed. So we do have a draft that is close to the final draft to be tested during the road test. And this is really the last opportunity to review the full methodology before we start the road test and before we finalize it. So yeah, in case there are some feedbacks on the indicators or the weightings, that would be very welcome, and we can still update it before launching the road test. To participate, you can reach the link that will lead you to the Scribe Hub platform, and you can reach it on the participate page of the ACT Initiative website. How to provide comments? It's really simple. You will get to this platform that you can see here on this slide. And so this is an example from the iron and steel sector. But you can provide comments on the, just as it is shown here on the right upper corner under the red arrow, by adding a comment all through the document. You can reach any part that you want to comment and add any feedback that you would like to share. So something that will be new for the new sectors that we are being developed currently is that we will provide two versions of the methodology. There will be one short version, and this is a new part that we are adding now, which will be between, I'd say, 30 or 50 pages. We are still working on it, so we don't have the final version of it, but it will be quite short. And there will be the longer version, which is actually the full version of the methodology that some of you may be used to if you have already been working on the ACT methodology. So the full version is really the document that you may find on the ACT website for any other sector, which provides you all the literature review, the details on the emissions of the sector and on every indicator. Plus the rationale of the weighting system, and I'd say any detail that relates to the methodology. But we have decided, since this version is quite long and is about 160 pages, to also provide a shorter version, especially if you're not familiar with ACT, which will give you more in a summary of the indicators that are in the methodology, the weightings, the scope and boundaries, and very briefly the scenarios. That can be very helpful to provide you an overview of the methodology and be able to provide more easily feedbacks on the methodology and the way we assess the companies. Okay, so I see that before moving on to the red test discussion, I saw that there was a question in the chat. Or okay, no, you have already answered it actually, Alice, I think.
Yeah, there was a question about showing the slides afterwards. So.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm not sure there will be a lot of questions for the public consultation, but yeah, if you have If any question comes while I'm going through the presentation, don't hesitate to ask it on the chat or in the Q&A box. So now moving on to the red test presentation, which is really that's the really big next step of this methodology development. We're now we will be testing the methodology that we are currently finalizing with a number of pilot companies in order to test the methodology and see how we can improve it. So here, in a nutshell, how the red test will be working for this sector. So the red test will be running from next September to February 2022. So it will be a time span of 6 months. We'll have a maximum of 15 pulp and paper companies. In case we have too many candidates, there will be a selection process. And the idea to select the companies is to have a very good value chain representation. So as Alice has presented to you, we have a number of, we have 3 different categories that we have identified for this sector. And we do want to have a good representation of this sector to do the red test. And ideally, if we can also have a geographically diverse group of companies, that will also help to understand and to test the methodology with the different constraints that may happen depending on the country. So we will be, as I said, testing the ACT methodology with voluntary pulp and paper companies. This ACT assessment will be totally free for the companies participating. The only cost would be in terms of time spent on the data collection. We'll talk about it a bit later. It's really for us the moment when we take the methodology from theory to application using real company data. So that would be also for us the opportunity to see what's feasible and what's not. So we are really testing the methodology at that stage. And based on the feedbacks that we'll have, we'll see what works and what doesn't, and we will update the methodology accordingly. What are the benefits for a company to take part to this red test? As I said, it will be a free ACT assessment. So normally an ACT assessment is not free. So it's really the opportunity to have to assess the company's low carbon strategy for free. The company also benefits from tailored recommendation to align with the Paris Agreement mitigation goals. So the idea is that the company will also benefit from feedbacks from specialized analysts. And we are also very open to feedbacks to improve the methodology. So it's also the opportunity to share your expertise to improve the methodology. You will also benefit from training on the ACT methodology through the analysts who will be working with you. And you can also communicate about your efforts to reduce the GHG emissions to partners and investors. You can also communicate on the score you'll get and from this red test. How about the schedule? So we are starting this red test in September, during which there will be the kickoff meetings. Then the data collection will run from October to November. Then there is a third phase during which the analysts gets back to the companies with potentially with to complete the data collection. And at this stage, the analysts will rerun the assessments using the tool. So during that phase, the company will be probably less asked to add more data. And in January, we're expecting to we're expecting the consultants and the analysts to give tailored feedbacks and scores to the companies. And finally, in February, we'll have the final meeting with a group of companies to discuss the lessons learned and see how we can improve the methodology. This is the example of restricted examples of companies that have joined the run tests for the different sectors for which we have a specific methodology. But we have more since we are currently running other run tests. Here are a number of examples of feedbacks that we have gotten from the run tests. So it can be feedbacks, positive feedbacks, I'd say, from companies stating the assessment was really useful for them to see how they can improve their climate strategy, to have it has helped them having a global perspective of the climate strategy for the sector. It was also helpful to have a sector-focused assessment of their climate strategy. But we are, again, still very open to have your feedbacks to improve our methodology and the way we're asking the data. So we may also have feedbacks asking perhaps to clarify a bit more the calculation, rationale, and data for a number of indicators. And the value chain can sometimes also be clarified because we are describing the categories that we want to include in the scope, but we may want to adjust it after the road test. Now let's talk about the outputs, the guarantees, and commitments. In terms of the outputs, for a company that has been that has done the road test, there will be 3 outputs for each of these companies. One is individual company report, which is confidential to each company. So each individual company report is confidential to each company. Secondly, there is a full road test public report, which is a summary of the road test and aggregate anonymized company scores. And finally, there will be the methodology feedback report, which is basically the updated methodology reports with the updates that we will do based on the feedbacks that we have had from the road test. For the individual company report, that will be really the company's full score breakdown. So you will be able, if you follow the road test, to have all the details of the scores that the company has got. So for each module, the score of each module, of each indicator, etc. So it's really tailored feedback from your company. Typically, there will be the detail of the performance score with the score of each modules and indicators, the identification of positive trends of the companies and areas of improvement, the analysis of the company's overall narrative score, and then the trend score, which gives the company's future trend, which will be based on current analysis made from the consultant. And there will be recommendations for future low carbon transition. Then the road test output will be a summary of the road tests and aggregated scores, which again are anonymized. So for example, this is the example of the transport sector. We have provided the average score, the maximum score, and the minimum score. And we have also given the details of the quantitative and the qualitative modules for on average. So yeah, we were just showing what were the modules that worked better than the others, and explaining the reasons why for a number of modules the scores may be low or may be high. And finally, the third output is a methodology feedback report. And here we are aggregating the feedback that we've got from the road test and suggesting modifications to the methodology to really have the improved and updated version of the pulp and paper methodology. Now let's talk about the guarantees, especially on the confidentiality guarantees. So this is a very important point for any company of any sector joining the road test. We are signing an NDA between the company, ADEM, and the consultants to share the individual company's data. So your data absolutely remain confidential. Your individual ACT score also remains confidential, as well as the breakdown of the scores per module and per indicator. The only thing that we can publicly communicate would be the aggregated score with all the company that joined the road test. And of course, as I said, the final road test report will present aggregated and anonymized score, and the individual company's report is confidential. In terms of the training, so all the analysts that will do the road test with the pilot companies will be fully trained in ACT initiative and the sectoral methodology prior to the road test. And then the company will benefit from this training, I would say, through the analysts who will be working with them. So of course, it will be a totally collaborative process, as the ACT team remains at your disposal for any questions through the road test. So we are still available if you have any question. What are the commitments from the companies for the road tests? First, we need to select a project lead. Then the biggest part of the road test will be to collect the data for the ACT assessment. To this end, we have estimated that the company should dedicate from 5 to 10 working days to the road test. That includes both collecting the data and the meetings that are coming all along the process. We ask the companies to be actively engaged through the process from initiation to completion. And the company will agree, we need to agree that CDP and ADEM can communicate about the road test. But again, it's on the aggregated and anonymized scores only. Just to give you an overview of the data required for this sector. So in case the company has already responded to the CDP questionnaire, we can reuse it. There is a number of indicators that are strongly linked to the CDP questionnaire that we can reuse to complete the ACT assessment. We can also use the company's CSR and annual reports. And plus, we'll be asking for other data, which would be, for example, the types of activity, whether the company is a pulp and paper maker, a converter. We'll be asking for the emissions intensity, absolute targets, asset lifetimes, the number of assets and plants, R&D expenditures, efforts on reducing impact on deforestation, and the sources of energy. This is just at a glance the type of data that we will be asking for this specific sector. This list is not exhaustive, and the full list is available on the methodology. Now, moving on to a poll. So Alice has prepared normally a poll on the platform, on the WebEx platform. We're interested to know if, in general, if you're interested in taking part of the road test. That's for us to have an idea of the companies that would be potentially interested in joining the road test. So yeah, the poll is just being launched. So yeah, feel free to give us your feedbacks.
Thanks, Anais. Yes, I've just launched a poll, so it should appear on the right-hand side of the WebEx screen. So yeah, we'd like to know if you're interested in taking part in the road test, if you are a company. So we'll give it just a few more seconds just to make sure that everyone has time to answer. All right, I'll leave it open for 10 more seconds and then we'll move on to the next steps. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll then.
Thank you for your participation. I saw that there was a question. I don't know if you, okay, that there is a question in the chat, in the Q&A box, on whether we could share the list of all the licensed consultants who are ACT trained. It's a good question, actually. I'm wondering if we do have we must have this list. I'm just wondering if it's available somewhere. I don't know, Alice, if you know that better than I. Or yes, Marlène, if you have a, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marlène Dresch from ADEM, the ACT team as well. Yes, the list is available. I think you can ask directly through the ACT email box, info@actinitiative.org, or if you go, if you visit our website, we have the full list of consultants that are trained, and I will check and put perhaps the direct link in the chat. But perhaps what you can remind Anais is that the consultants are already chosen for this road test.
Yes, yeah. Very good point, Marlène. Thank you very much. Yes, so for the road test, it's the process is a bit different from a regular ACT assessment, where you would be able to choose the analyst who will be working with you. For the road test, ADEM is recruiting a team of consultants who will be working on the road tests with the companies. So for pulp and paper sector, it's actually the same team who has been working on the methodology development, who will also work on the road tests. So yes, for testing the methodology, companies are not asked to choose their own consultants. So yeah, it's already all chosen. Okay, so we can move on to the next steps. So how to apply to participate to the road tests. So there are two documents, documents. One is a call for proposals, which will actually provide you with all the information that we have that we have provided now during this webinar, and the terms of reference, which need to be signed and completed by the company, and which also have the application form that needs to be returned by email to the email that you can see here, info@actinitiative.org, before the end of August. But of course, if you need to reach out to us to have more information, Alice and I are still available to answer any of your questions. So yeah, here is in a nutshell all of the takeaways from this webinar. So first, the public consultation, which will be open until the end of June, and which is open to all stakeholders. It's not limited to the participants of the methodology development. So don't hesitate to share it to your partners and to contribute yourselves as well. And yeah, it's a final consultation before the retest, so it's a last opportunity to add a comment for us to adjust the methodology. And then the retest that will be running for 6 months from September, and which is open to 15 pulp and paper companies. And for this, we have a deadline that will be by the end of August to submit your application. Don't hesitate to visit our website and to also to get all the informations on the participate tab, or also to reach out to Alice or I with the emails you can see you can see here on the screen. And if you want to watch the webinar again or to share it, the webinar is recorded and is also available online. So yeah, thank you for your participation. And if you have any question, we have still 5 minutes to answer them.
I don't see any more questions coming through. Oh, actually, as I say that, I think there is one. Anis, I'll read it out for you, maybe. So the question is, can you describe how a company can use the road test process to establish a science-based target?
Well, actually, not very familiar with SBT for the pulp and paper sector, but I guess it's something in terms of the targets that will help setting the targets for ACT, which you can reuse in SBTI process, for example. Alice, I don't know if you want to complete on this.
Yeah, I can say a few words, and then if anyone else from the team wants to jump in, feel free to as well. I guess it's worth just clarifying that ACT will not help you set a science-based target just because it's not set up for that. Its aim is to assess the climate strategy and the commitments that the company has already put in place. But as you've seen, we do look at targets, and we do look at the ambition of your targets. So there will be an indicator looking at that and kind of assessing whether the ambition of your target is aligned with the kind of benchmark that we've set. So this will give you an idea, but it will give you an idea of like whether your target is ambitious enough or not, but it's not specifically following the SBT methodology. So.
Yes, it's really independent. So.
Well, yeah, I guess it's. I mean, we've tried to align with SBT whenever we could, but there's nothing specific for pulp and paper for the from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So we haven't been able to use any of their kind of methodology or lessons learned for that specific sector.
Okay, I don't see any other question.
No, me neither. So I guess we can close there. And if you've got any other questions or any other comments, don't hesitate to either get in touch or please take part in the public consultation as well to share feedback.
Yes, we'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you very
joining.
much.
And have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.